The morning mist hung over the plains of Abraham on September 13, 1759, and in those early hours, the Marquis de Montcalm faced a decision that would determine not just the fate of a battle or even a city, but the political structure of an entire continent for centuries to come. Before him stood approximately 4,800 British soldiers who had accomplished what seemed impossible, scaling the cliffs in darkness and deploying in battle formation on the open ground west of Quebec. Behind him, inside the city and in camps to the east, Montcalm had access to over 16,000 men if he waited to concentrate his forces. To the west, Colonel Bougainville commanded 3,000 French troops who could arrive within hours if summoned. Montcalm could have waited, could have used his overwhelming numerical superiority, could have coordinated a devastating attack from multiple directions that would have trapped Wolfe's army between converging French forces with no line of retreat except back down the cliffs they had climbed. Instead, Montcalm made the decision to attack immediately with the roughly 4,500 men he had readily available, a decision that would prove catastrophically wrong within 15 minutes of the battle's commencement. That single decision, born of miscalculation, impetuosity, and perhaps a failure to fully grasp the strategic situation, led directly to French defeat at Quebec, to the collapse of French power in North America, to British control of Canada, to the financial crisis that prompted British taxation of the American colonies, and ultimately to the American Revolution and the birth of the United States. America exists today in the form it takes because Montcalm made one profoundly stupid decision on that September morning, and the consequences of that decision cascaded through history in ways that Montcalm, dying from wounds received in the battle he should never have fought, could never have imagined. To understand why Montcalm's decision was so catastrophically wrong, one must understand the strategic situation at Quebec in September 1759. General James Wolfe had been besieging Quebec since late June, trying desperately to find some way to bring the French army to battle, on terms favorable to British linear tactics. For 3 months, Wolfe had failed. He had bombarded the city, reducing much of the lower town to ruins, but failing to breach the fortifications. He had attempted a frontal assault on French entrenchments at Beauport east of the city, but the attack had been repulsed with heavy casualties. He had raided up and down the river, burning Canadian farms and settlements in a campaign of terror, designed to draw Montcalm out, but the French commander had refused to abandon his strong defensive positions. Montcalm's strategy was fundamentally sound. Time was on his side. The British fleet would have to leave before the Saint-Cyr, and Christina was out. Lawrence froze, probably by mid-October. If Quebec could hold out for another month, the British would be forced to withdraw, and Quebec would be saved. All Montcalm had to do was avoid a decisive battle and wait for winter. Wolfe was desperate. His army was wasting away from disease and casualties. His brigadiers were losing confidence in his leadership. The campaign season was running out. The landing on the plains of Abraham was a last desperate gamble, a plan proposed by Wolfe's subordinates when his own plans had all failed. On the night of September 12th, British troops loaded into boats and drifted downstream on the tide, landing at the base of the cliffs at a cove where a narrow path led upward. French sentries were deceived or overwhelmed. The troops climbed the cliffs in darkness, dragging themselves up by roots and branches. By dawn, Wolfe had his army on the plains, but his position was actually quite precarious. He had no line of retreat, except back down the cliffs. He had limited ammunition and supplies, because everything had to be manhandled up the cliff path. His army was tired from the night march and the climb. He had no cavalry and limited artillery. If the French attacked him with overwhelming force from multiple directions, his army could be destroyed completely. Montcalm was awakened before dawn with reports that British troops were on the plains. His immediate reaction was disbelief, then alarm, then a fatal rush to immediate action. He rowed out to sea for himself, confirmed that yes, thousands of British troops were deployed in battle formation, and made his decision within what could only have been minutes. He would attack immediately with the forces he had readily at hand, primarily French regular battalions and Canadian militia, without waiting for reinforcements, without coordinating with Bougainville's force upstream, without taking the time to properly organize his attack. His reasoning, to the extent we can reconstruct it from fragmentary accounts, was that every hour the British remained on the plains allowed them to strengthen their position, to bring up more troops and artillery from the landing site, to entrench, to become a permanent threat to Quebec. Better to strike now, while they were still vulnerable, and drive them back over the cliffs before they could consolidate. This reasoning was catastrophically flawed on multiple levels. First, Montcalm vastly underestimated how long it would take the British to meaningfully strengthen their position. They were on open ground with minimal tools for entrenchment. They had limited artillery. They could bring up more troops, but Montcalm had access to far more reinforcements than Wolfe did. Every hour that passed would favor Montcalm more than Wolfe, if Montcalm used that time to concentrate his forces. Second, Montcalm failed to recognize that Wolfe wanted exactly what Montcalm was about to give him: a conventional battle on open ground where British linear tactics and volley fire could be employed to maximum effect. The British had spent 3 months trying to lure the French into exactly this kind of engagement. Now Montcalm was obliging them without being forced to do so. Third, Montcalm committed one of the cardinal sins of military leadership. He let his emotions override his judgment. He was angry that the British had reached the plains, angry at the failure of security, angry that his defensive strategy was now threatened. That anger drove him to hasty action when careful deliberation was required. What should Montcalm have done? The correct decision was so obvious in hindsight that it seems almost incomprehensible that an experienced commander like Montcalm could have failed to see it. He should have immediately sent messengers to Bougainville, ordering him to march toward Quebec from the west with all speed. He should have concentrated every available man from the various camps and positions around Quebec, bringing his full force to bear. He should have positioned troops to block any British retreat while avoiding a general engagement until his forces were fully concentrated. Then, with perhaps 10,000 or 12,000 men against Wolfe's 4,800, with French forces able to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, he could have destroyed the British army completely. Wolfe would have been trapped, outnumbered more than 2 to 1, with his back to the cliffs and no line of retreat. The British would have faced a choice between annihilation on the plains or a disastrous attempt to retreat down the cliffs under fire, probably losing most of their force either way. If Montcalm had won such a battle, if Wolfe's army had been destroyed on the plains of Abraham, the consequences would have cascaded through history in the opposite direction from what actually occurred. The British campaign against Quebec would have failed catastrophically, with an entire army lost, a talented young general killed or captured, and British prestige shattered. The Royal Navy would have withdrawn from the Saint-Prestige shattered, Lawrence unable to accomplish anything without the army. Quebec would have held. Montcalm would have been celebrated as the savior of New France. The momentum of the war in North America would have shifted dramatically. British plans to attack Montreal in 1760 would have been impossible without first taking Quebec. The war might have ground on inconclusively, or France might have gained advantage in negotiations, retaining at least part of their North American empire in any peace settlement. But Montcalm did not wait. He did not concentrate his forces. He did not coordinate with Bougainville. Instead, he marched out of Quebec with approximately 4,500 men and attacked Wolfe's army in a conventional linear engagement, the exact kind of battle that played to every British strength and negated most French advantages. Montcalm's mixed force of regulars and militia advanced across the plains, firing as they came, but firing at long range where musket fire was ineffective, and failing to maintain the perfect line cohesion that made volley fire devastating. The British, by contrast, held their fire with iron discipline, waited until the French were at approximately 40 yards, and then delivered two perfectly synchronized volleys that shattered the French line. The battle was over in minutes. The French army broke and fled. Montcalm was mortally wounded. Wolfe was killed but died, knowing he had won. 5 days later, Quebec surrendered. The following year, Montreal fell. By 1760, all of New France was in British hands. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized what Montcalm's decision had determined, that France would cede Canada to Britain. The chain of consequences from Montcalm's decision extends directly to the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. Britain's victory in the French and Indian War came at enormous financial cost. The national debt doubled. The annual interest payments on that debt consumed nearly 60% of government revenue. Britain faced a fiscal crisis of unprecedented magnitude, and British politicians looked to the American colonies to help pay for the war that had been fought largely for colonial benefit. The colonies had been defended against French encroachment. They had gained security and room for westward expansion. Surely, British politicians reasoned, the colonists should contribute to the costs of that defense and to the ongoing expenses of garrisoning and administering the vast new territories Britain had acquired. This logic led directly to the taxation measures that provoked colonial resistance. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, the Tea Act of 1773, all of these were attempts to raise revenue from the colonies to address Britain's post-war financial crisis. The colonial reaction to these taxes, the principle of no taxation without representation, the organized resistance through boycotts and protests, the escalating cycle of British enforcement and colonial defiance, all of this flowed from Britain's decision to tax the colonies, which flowed from Britain's financial crisis, which flowed from the costs of the French and Indian War, which Britain won because Quebec fell, which fell because Montcalm lost the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which he lost because he attacked when he should have waited. Consider the counterfactual chain. If Montcalm had made the correct decision, if Quebec had held in 1759, and if French Canada had survived the war, Britain's financial situation would still have been difficult, but perhaps not as catastrophic. The costs of conquering and garrisoning Canada represented a significant portion of Britain's war expenses. Without those costs, without the perceived need to defend vast new territories in North America, the fiscal pressure to tax the colonies might have been less severe, or might have been applied differently. More fundamentally, if French Canada had survived as a neighboring threat to the British colonies, the strategic situation in North America would have been completely different. The British colonies would have remained hemmed in east of the Appalachians, unable to expand westward, constantly threatened by French military power and French allied Indian tribes. The colonial assemblies would have needed British military protection in ways they did not need it after French power was eliminated. The bargaining position between Britain and the colonies would have been fundamentally different if there was still a French Canada against which the colonies needed protection. Moreover, the presence of a strong French Canada might have prevented the American Revolution from succeeding, even if it had started. One reason the Continental Army was able to maintain itself through the long years of the Revolutionary War was that there was no major external threat to worry about. The war was entirely about the internal constitutional dispute between Britain and the colonies. But if French Canada still existed, many colonists might have feared that rebellion against Britain would leave them vulnerable to French attack. The divisions among colonists during the Revolution, between patriots and loyalists, might have fallen differently if there was a French threat to consider. Conversely, if the Revolution had occurred and succeeded, a French Canada might have allied with Britain against the rebellious colonies, providing bases for British operations and threatening the northern frontier. The strategic geography of the Revolution was fundamentally shaped by the fact that Britain controlled Canada. which was a consequence of Montcalm's decision at Quebec. Montcalm's decision was not just a tactical error that lost a battle. It was a strategic catastrophe that lost a continent. Other French defeats in the French and Indian War were serious, but potentially reversible. The fall of Louisbourg in 1758 was a blow, but Louisbourg had fallen before and been returned to France through treaty negotiations. Other frontier defeats could be attributed to the fortunes of war, to British numerical superiority, to the difficulty of defending such vast territories with limited resources. But the Battle of the Plains of Abraham was different because it was so completely unnecessary, and so obviously the result of Montcalm's poor judgment. The battle did not have to be fought. Montcalm was not forced into it by circumstances beyond his control. He chose to fight when every consideration of strategy, tactics, and common sense argued for waiting. He gave Wolfe exactly what Wolfe needed, a conventional engagement on open ground, when he could instead have trapped and destroyed the British army by using his numerical superiority properly. The irony is that Montcalm had been conducting an effective defensive campaign for 3 months. He had frustrated Wolfe at every turn. He had refused to be drawn into the kind of battle that actually occurred on September 13th. His patient, cautious strategy had been working. Quebec was holding. The British were running out of time. If Montcalm had simply continued the strategy that had been succeeding, if he had remained patient for just a few more hours while he concentrated his forces, history would have been completely different. But in that crucial moment, facing an unexpected British presence on the plains, Montcalm abandoned the strategy that had been working and made a snap decision based on emotion rather than careful analysis. That decision killed him, killed hundreds of his soldiers, lost Quebec, lost Canada, lost North America for France, cost Britain a fortune that led to colonial taxation, and set in motion the sequence of events that created the United States. The question of why Montcalm made such an obviously wrong decision has fascinated historians for over 2 centuries. Various explanations have been proposed. Some argue that Montcalm underestimated Wolfe's army, perhaps believing it was smaller than it actually was, or in worse condition. Some suggest that Montcalm was misled by subordinates about the availability of reinforcements. Some point to tensions between Montcalm and the governor of New France, suggesting that Montcalm felt he could not wait because political considerations demanded immediate action. Some emphasize Montcalm's personality, describing him as impetuous, prone to quick decisions, and overly confident in his ability to defeat the British in open battle. Some note that Montcalm was a European officer trained in European warfare who may have underestimated the effectiveness of British troops or overestimated the capability of his own mixed force of regulars and militia. All of these explanations probably contain elements of truth, but they all point to the same conclusion. Montcalm made a bad decision because he failed to properly assess the situation, failed to think through the consequences, and failed to exercise the patience and judgment that the strategic situation demanded. He had time to make a better decision. The British were not going anywhere. Their position on the plains actually became stronger as an argument for waiting rather than attacking, because a stronger British position would be even harder to dislodge, and thus more urgent to attack quickly. But this logic was backwards. A British force that was entrenching and strengthening its position could be besieged and starved rather than attacked frontally. French forces could have surrounded the British position, cut off their supply line down the cliffs, and waited for the British either to attack French positions at disadvantage or to attempt a retreat under fire. Either way, the French would have had the advantage if Montcalm had simply waited and used his superior numbers intelligently. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham stands as one of the most dramatic examples in military history of how a single bad decision by one commander can have consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Battles are often decided by small factors, by luck, by the decisions of junior officers, by weather, by 100 variables that no commander can fully control. But at Quebec, The outcome was decided by one clear, unambiguous decision by the French commanding general, a decision that was wrong at the time and that every subsequent analysis has confirmed was wrong. Montcalm had options. He had alternatives. He had the resources to win if he used them properly. Montcalm had options. He had the resources to win if he used them properly. He chose not to wait, and that choice lost everything. The United States exists today as a nation stretching from Atlantic to Pacific because of a complex web of historical causation involving geography, economics, ideology, and military force. But trace back the causal chains, and you repeatedly find key decision points where events could have gone differently, and few of those decision points were as clear-cut or as consequential as Montcalm's decision to attack immediately on the Plains of Abraham. If he had waited, if he had done what any reasonable analysis of the situation suggested, the British Army might have been destroyed, Quebec might have held, French Canada might have survived. The entire history of North America would have developed along different lines, and the United States might never have existed, and supplied, or might have existed only as a small Atlantic seaboard nation, hemmed in by French power to the north and west. The America that grew to continental power, that expanded across the territories Britain acquired from France, that eventually became a global superpower, that America traces its origins in significant part to one French general's catastrophic failure of judgment on a September morning in 1759. Montcalm's decision was not the only factor in American independence, but it was a necessary factor, a decision point where history pivoted in a direction it did not have to go. America exists because Montcalm made one stupid decision, and that decision still shapes the world over 2.5 centuries later.